I thought I knew my brother better than anyone, until one quiet evening when the house emptied out and he asked me a question so gentle, so unexpected, that it cracked something open inside me. What he confessed wasn't dramatic or loud, but it changed the way I saw him, myself, and the meaning of family forever. Greetings, dear listeners. Before I begin telling this complicated story of my life, I ask you to support our channel, subscribe, leave a like, and write in the comments which city you are listening from. This is very important for us. And now, enjoy listening. The evening it happened felt ordinary in that way life often does before it surprises you. The house was finally quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes after everyone else has gone to bed or gone out. My parents were away for the weekend, and the sun had already dipped low enough to leave long shadows stretching across the living room floor. I remember standing by the window, watching the streetlights blink on one by one, thinking about nothing in particular. My brother was sitting at the dining table behind me. He'd been there for a while, pretending to scroll through his phone, though I could tell he wasn't really reading anything. He kept clearing his throat softly, like he wanted to speak but wasn't sure how to begin. We've always had that unspoken way of knowing when the other is restless. Growing up close in age does that to you. You learn the sound of each other's silence. I turned and asked if he wanted some tea. It was my way of opening a door without pushing. He nodded, but when I set the mugs down and sat across from him, he didn't reach for his. He just wrapped his hands around it, letting the steam fog his glasses. He spoke very softly then, so softly, I almost missed it. "Can I ask you something?" he said. There was nothing unusual in the words, but something in his tone made my chest tighten. He wasn't joking, wasn't trying to tease the way he usually did. His voice had a carefulness to it, like he was handling something fragile. "Of course," I said, trying to sound casual. He looked up at me, really looked, like he was seeing me not just as his sister, but as another adult sitting across the table. That alone was enough to unsettle me. I suddenly became aware of how grown we both were, how the years had quietly passed while we were busy surviving them. "Do you ever feel like you're afraid of becoming invisible?" he asked. The question took me completely by surprise. I've been expecting something practical, money, work, maybe a favor. Not that. Not something so raw and exposed. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The ticking of the clock on the wall sounded louder than it ever had. I asked him what he meant, gently. He shrugged, eyes dropping back to the table. His fingers traced a small crack in the wood, one I'd known since childhood. "I feel like I'm supposed to be strong all the time," he said. "Like if I stop being useful or quiet or easy to deal with, no one will really notice me anymore." There it was, that soft confession hanging between us. I felt it settle into me, stirring memories I hadn't named yet. Moments when I felt the same, walking through rooms where everyone expected something from me but never asked how I was doing. I told him the truth, that I felt invisible more often than I liked to admit. That even at my age, between college and work and trying to figure out who I was supposed to become, I sometimes felt like I was fading into the background of my own life. He listened carefully, nodding, his shoulders slowly relaxing. The tension I hadn't realized he was carrying seemed to ease, just a little. The way he looked at me then wasn't dramatic or emotional. It was grateful, as if simply being heard had steadied him. The kitchen light buzzed faintly above us, casting a warm yellow glow. Outside, a car passed, tires hissing on pavement. Life continued as normal, but something between us had shifted. I realized in that moment that personal discovery doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it comes quietly, in a familiar room, from someone you thought you already understood. When he finally picked up his mug and took a sip, he smiled, small and real. I felt a strange mix of protectiveness and respect. He wasn't just my little brother anymore. He was a person learning to voice his fears, and I was learning that listening could be an act of love. That night, as we talked a little longer about nothing and everything, I sensed that this conversation was only the beginning. Something had been opened, and neither of us knew yet where it would lead. But for the first time in a long while, I felt present, visible, and deeply connected, to him and to myself. After that night, something subtle followed us through the house, like a quiet echo neither of us mentioned out loud. It wasn't awkward exactly, but it wasn't nothing either. Next morning, I woke to the smell of coffee already brewing, which was unusual. My brother was never an early riser unless he absolutely had to be. I padded into the kitchen in my socks and found him standing by the counter, hair still messy, staring out the window as if the day might explain itself if he looked long enough. He turned when he heard me and smiled, the same small, careful smile from the night before. It felt like a continuation of a sentence we hadn't finished. "Morning," he said. "Morning," I answered, leaning against the doorway. For a second, I considered teasing him about the coffee, about his sudden domestic energy, but I stopped myself. Some moments don't need jokes layered over them. We drank in silence for a while. The sunlight was brighter than it had been the evening before, washing the kitchen in pale gold. Dust motes floated lazily between us, visible only because of the light. I remember thinking how strange it was that something so ordinary could feel so loaded. Finally, he cleared his throat again. Not as nervous this time, but still cautious. "I was thinking about what you said," he told me. "About feeling invisible sometimes." I nodded, waiting. "It helped," he said simply. "More than you know." That should have been enough. It was enough. And yet, I felt something tug at me, an urge to say more, to step a little deeper into the honesty we'd stumbled into the night before. I told him about my own fears, the ones I usually brushed off because I thought I was too young to be weighed down by them. I talked about the pressure of choosing the right path, about wondering if I was disappointing people without realizing it. He listened the same way I had listened to him. No interruptions. No advice unless I asked for it. Just presence. It struck me then how rarely we give each other that kind of attention, even within families. Especially within families. Later that afternoon, we decided to take a walk. The weather was mild, one of those days that doesn't demand anything from you. The neighborhood was familiar, but as we walked side by side, it felt new, like we were seeing it through older eyes. The sound of gravel under our shoes, the smell of cut grass, the distant laughter of kids playing somewhere we couldn't see, it all seemed sharper. We talked about childhood memories, the harmless ones, riding bikes until dinner, arguing over who got the front seat. I laughed at a story he told about getting lost once and being too embarrassed to ask for help. He admitted he'd been scared, though he'd never said so at the time. "You always seemed fearless," I said. He shook his head. "I just didn't want anyone to worry." That sentence landed heavier than he probably intended. I realized how long he'd been carrying that habit, how early he'd learned to shrink his own fears to make room for everyone else's comfort. And in that realization, I saw a reflection of myself. When we reached the park at the end of the street, we sat on a bench, watching the slow rhythm of people passing by. An older man walked his dog. A couple argued quietly near the swings. Life in small, honest fragments. "Do you think it ever gets easier?" he asked suddenly. "Being yourself without apologizing for it?" I thought about it. About the men I'd known, the way so many of them learned to swallow their feelings because they were told that was strength. About how women, too, learn their own versions of silence. "I think it gets easier when you stop pretending you're alone," I said. "When you let someone see you, even if it's uncomfortable." He nodded, eyes fixed on the ground. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The breeze lifted a strand of my hair, brushing it against my cheek, and I tucked it behind my ear, feeling older than I had a week ago. That walk back home felt different. Lighter somehow, as if acknowledging the weight made it easier to carry. That night, lying in my bed, I stared at the ceiling and replayed the last 24 hours. I realized that personal discovery isn't always about learning something new about yourself. Sometimes it's about recognizing something that's been there all along, waiting for permission to exist. My brother's soft question had opened a door I didn't know I needed. And as sleep finally crept in, I sensed that whatever came next, we'd face it with a little more honesty and a lot more respect than before. The days that followed settled into a new rhythm, one that looked ordinary from the outside but felt quietly transformed on the inside. We went back to our routines, me juggling classes and part-time work, him buried in his own responsibilities. But there was an unspoken understanding between us now. It showed up in small ways. A longer pause before one of us left the room. A glance that lingered just a second more than usual. A question asked without rushing past the answer. One evening, About a week later, the power went out during a storm. It wasn't dramatic. No thunder shaking the walls, but the rain was steady and insistent, tapping against the windows like it had something to say. We lit a few candles and sat in the living room, the familiar furniture softened by flickering shadows. The world outside felt far away, reduced to rain and darkness. He sat on the floor, leaning against the couch, while I curled up on one end with a blanket pulled over my legs. The candlelight caught the side of his face, making him look younger somehow, like the boy he used to be when he'd fall asleep during movies and pretend he wasn't tired. "This reminds me of when we were kids," I said. "Remember when the power went out for almost a whole day?" He smiled. "You were convinced monsters would come out once it got dark." "I was not," I protested, then laughed. "Okay, maybe a little. You made me sit outside your door all night," he said. Said I was the only one brave enough. The memory warmed me more than the blanket. I hadn't thought about that night in years, but now it seemed connected somehow. Even then, we'd been protecting each other in our own clumsy ways. The rain grew heavier, and the house creaked softly, settling into itself. After a while, his smile faded into something more thoughtful. "Can I ask you another question?" he said. There it was again, that careful tone. I nodded, my stomach tightening, but not in fear, in anticipation. "Do you ever worry," he said slowly, "that the people you love only see the version of you that's useful to them?" I didn't answer right away. The candle flickered, bending the shadows along the walls. I thought about the expectations placed on me, being responsible, being agreeable, being strong even when I didn't feel like it. I thought about how easy it was to slip into roles without realizing you'd done it. "Yes," I said finally, "all the time." He exhaled like he'd been holding that breath longer than I knew. He told me then about his work, about feeling replaceable, about watching older men around him who'd given decades to the same place only to be quietly pushed aside. He said it scared him, not just losing a job, but losing relevance, losing the sense that he mattered. As he spoke, I realized something important. The audience we imagine for our lives, the people we think we need to impress, satisfy, or please, often shapes us more than we admit. And sitting there, listening to my brother voice fears that many men carry silently, I felt a deep respect for his honesty. I reached out without thinking and rested my hand on his shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but he stiffened at first, then relaxed. He didn't look at me, but he didn't pull away either. "You matter," I said, "not because of what you provide or how quiet you are, just because you exist." The words surprised me as much as they seemed to surprise him. They felt true, solid, like something I needed to hear as much as he did. The power came back on shortly after, the lights flickering to life too brightly, too suddenly. We blinked, momentarily disoriented, as if we'd been pulled out of another world. He stood and stretched, the moment easing, but not disappearing. Later that night, alone in my room, I sat at my desk and opened my notebook. I hadn't written anything personal in months. I stared at the blank page, then began to write, not about him exactly, but about the feeling of being seen, and the courage it takes to let someone see you. I realized then that growth doesn't always come from grand events or big decisions. Sometimes it comes from quiet conversations during storms, from questions asked softly enough to be honest. My brother's voice that night stayed with me as I turned off the lamp and lay down to sleep. I sensed we were nearing something important, something that would require even more openness from both of us. And for the first time, instead of fearing it, I felt ready. The days that followed seemed almost ordinary at first, but the quiet understanding between us had grown roots deep enough to be felt in every interaction. Even small gestures, like him leaving my favorite mug on the counter, or me noticing he'd stacked the firewood just the way he knew I liked it, carried weight. It was as though each act of care was a word in a conversation we hadn't yet fully spoken out loud. One evening, my brother asked me to join him on the porch. The sun was dipping low, casting streaks of amber across the backyard, and the air was cool, scented faintly of pine and the last warmth of the day. I grabbed a blanket and followed him, not knowing what to expect but trusting the moment. He was already there, sitting with his elbows on his knees, staring out at the horizon. "I wanted to talk," he said softly, as if the words themselves needed to be careful not to fall too harshly on the quiet evening. About everything. I nodded, sitting down beside him, the blanket draping over both our shoulders. The porch creaked under us, but it felt comforting, grounding. I've been thinking a lot about our conversations, he began. About how easy it is to pretend you're okay, and how much harder it is to actually tell someone when you're not. I listened, knowing he'd already been practicing honesty with me for weeks. I could feel the tension in his shoulders ease slightly as he spoke, like he was letting the truth seep out in small doses. I want you to know, he continued, that I've always admired you, not for what you do, or how well you handle things, but for who you are, even when you feel invisible to yourself. I blinked, trying to hold back the lump forming in my throat. His words were gentle but deliberate, and they reached into a part of me I hadn't realized was still tender from years of trying to measure up to invisible standards. I've realized, he went on, that we spend so much time hiding our fears, pretending that we're unshakable, and sometimes, the people we love the most don't see us. Not really, until we let them, and I don't want that to happen between us. I felt a surge of gratitude and warmth. Here was my brother, my family, showing vulnerability that I had always associated with strength, not weakness. I reached for his hand and squeezed it. I don't want that either, I said. I want us to see each other, fully, even the parts that scare us, even the quiet, invisible parts. We sat in silence then, watching the sky change colors as the sun sank lower, feeling the wind pick up gently through the trees. The moments stretched, not in awkwardness, but in completeness, like we had finally stepped into a space where nothing needed to be proven. After a while, he spoke again, his voice almost a whisper. Thank you for listening, for noticing me. I smiled, feeling tears prick at the edges of my eyes. Thank you, I said, for trusting me. It struck me then that the deepest emotional connections aren't built on grand gestures or dramatic declarations. They are built in the quiet, steady presence of one person willing to see another fully, and the courage of the other willing to be seen. That night, when I returned to my room, I felt different, not dramatically so, but with a subtle shift inside, as if a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying had lifted slightly. I thought about my brother, about the honesty we had shared, and about the discovery that vulnerability is not a weakness, but a form of strength that fosters connection. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I reflected on the journey from that first soft question to this quiet understanding. Life had not suddenly changed, but the way I experienced it had. I felt more present, more attuned, and more capable of meeting both the world and the people I loved with authenticity. In the end, it wasn't about answers or conclusions. It was about presence, respect, and the courage to ask questions, even softly, that have the power to open hearts. And I realized, as sleep finally took me, that sometimes the most profound discoveries come not from dramatic revelations, but from moments of quiet truth shared with someone who truly cares. We had begun that journey with a single soft question, and now, sitting in the calm after, I knew that our lives had shifted forever, not because of what was asked, but because we had chosen to listen.